Well, I want to first thank you all for coming today.
Yeah, thank you.
That you braved all the closures on the streets, got through the marathon, and made it here. I'm Steve Ross. I'm the director of the Casden Institute, and I'm also a professor in the history department here at USC. And I want to welcome you to the 13th annual Dr. Harold Lee Lecture. And today we're honored to bring you a panel discussion on the topic of doing business in America, a Jewish history. And this event is the offshoot of the original research and a fresh spin on the topic of Jews and business in America from the colonial era through the 20th century. And these are three of the essays that are in our volume here, which is for sale when you leave, very reasonably priced. And it's called Doing Business in America. In fact, our moderator for tonight's panel, Dr. Hasia Diner, is the editor of the volume, and professors Jonathan Karp and Matthew Garcia contributed essays as well. Well, today I'm honored to welcome three scholars whose cutting-edge research has made them very prominent in their fields. Hasia Diner serves as the Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History, as well as Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and the Director of the Goldstein Gorin Center for American Jewish History, all at New York University. And she is the author of many books dealing with multiple aspects of Jewish life and history. Most recently, she did a biography of Julius Rosenwald, Repairing the World. She's written We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, and a sweeping book on the Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000. Welcome, Hasia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. How's the microphone?
Okay, and Jonathan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, did you want to introduce the other two?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, well, Jonathan Karp is an associate professor in the departments of Judaic Study and History at the Binghamton University of the State University of New York, in my childhood known as Harper.
Yep.
His work explored the roles that Jews have played in modern economic life and the images and stereotypes that have accompanied them. He's the author of The Politics of Jewish Commerce, Economic Thought and Emancipation in Europe. He's the co-editor of several books, the most prominent perhaps being the Cambridge History of Judaism in the early modern period. And he's currently working on a book, Chosen Surrogates, a class and cultural analysis of Black-Jewish relations. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And our last panelist, Matthew Garcia, is a professor and chair of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies and professor of history at Dartmouth College. He's worked in the intersection of labor history, business history, and Jewish history. And Professor Garcia is the author of A World of Its Own, Race, Labor, and Citrus in the Making of Greater Los Angeles. He's written From the Jaws of Victory, The Triumph and Tragedy of Cesar Chavez and the Farm Worker Movement. And he is currently working on a new book about Jewish businessman Eli Black, who he wrote about in this volume entitled Eli and the Octopus, the Man Who Failed to Tame the United Fruit Company. Welcome, Matthew. Thank you. Just a word on today's format. Our panelists are each going to talk for roughly 5 to 8 minutes about their work in this volume, and then they will engage in a discussion. And that'll take a total of roughly an hour, and then we're going to throw it open for your questions for a half hour. We will end promptly at 5:30, and then we invite you to a small reception we have afterwards. I would ask you, please, to turn off your cell phones. I always forget, so I want to remind you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator and editor of the volume, Hasia Diamond.
Thank
Hasia.
you. Okay, thanks. So I want to begin first by thanking Lisa and Steve for the tremendous help in getting this volume through, and indeed for asking me to do this. And it was really a pleasurable experience, and I learned a lot from my collaborators in this. So what I'd like to do in my 5 to 8 minutes is first say something about the book as a whole, and then to just say a little bit about my particular essay in it, and then pass off the baton. As to the book as a whole and the topic of Jews and business, doing business in America, is that first that it's not possible to overemphasize the centrality of business, the buying and selling of stuff, the exchange of money for goods in Jewish history as a whole. Doing business as a Jewish phenomenon took place at all times and everywhere. It's a subject, by the way, that historians have generally been Jewish historians have been somewhat reluctant to write about. And about 15 years ago, Derek Penslar wrote a book called Shylock's Children, in which he probed why Jewish historians have been somewhat skittish about writing about the history of Jews and business. So we are not skittish and see this as a really important topic and see it as first key to understanding Jewish migrations. And Jews migrated in large measure to places where they could do business and do it successfully. Business was crucial in structuring the relationships between Jews and non-Jews. In fact, for much of Jewish history, it was the key way in which Jews had any contact with their non-Jewish neighbors. And thirdly, which is what I wrote about, and again, I'll say just something briefly about it at the end of this little introduction, business played a very powerful role in shaping the inner life of Jewish communities. Jewish communities were very much built around business. One needs only an extremely superficial excursion into the Talmud to know how much of Jewish law is based on the principles governing business. Okay, business was at the heart of that sacred document. Our focus here in this volume is on America, but we in fact could have done a book on doing business in other places, Jews doing business in other places in the world. But I think one of the questions that I hope my co-panelists and collaborators here will think about is why the United States? Why is this an American topic? What did it mean to do business in America for Jews as opposed to other places around the world? If all the authors in this volume were represented, we would go from the 18th century into the middle of the 20th. And there's no time period where business wasn't at the heart, again, of drawing Jews to America, shaping Jewish interactions with other people, and creating their communities. So we want to think about what this means in the context of thinking about this project as an American topic. Okay, so my particular contribution to this volume, other than the introduction, was an essay called, I'm going to read you the title, American Jewish Business at the Street Level. And it looked at the way in which Jewish enclave life in New York, in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Chicago, in small towns as well as large ones, were very much shaped by the way in which the Jewish street was a place where Jews bought from other Jews, in which Jews sold to other Jews, and how that business relationship within the Jewish enclave, within the Jewish population, reflected issues of gender, okay, and issues of class and issues of religious ideology and other forms of potential cleavages or conflict within the community, how business played a role in bringing Jews together. Now, those Jewish neighborhoods were places where the basic goods of Jewish life, from food, clothing, and beyond, were exchanged within the boundaries of a community. But these were also places where non-Jews came to observe and to buy Jewish. And so this, my particular contribution, which in a way reflects my orientation as a social historian and as a historian of gender and class, looks at the Jewish street as a kind of giant marketplace. And why and how business both shaped those communities and spawned conflict within. So the other essays went in other directions. There's some biographical pieces. There's an essay on how Jewish involvement in retail played a role in rescue efforts of American Jewish businessmen, of German Jews in the wake of the Nazi rise to power. I will not even say anything about your two pieces, but there's a global dimension, Jewish business from the American colonies into the Caribbean and to the rest of the Atlantic world, as well as Jews from the Ottoman Empire who maintained business relationships with Jews in the United States. So these business relationships created Jewish communities, gave American Jews a particular role in the world, and created networks of exchange between Jews in the United States and Jews elsewhere. These essays are just the tip of the iceberg. We could have probably written 20 volumes and still not scratch the surface. And I hope that they will be of interest to readers, the general readers, but also I hope that they'll inspire scholars to look at business as a Jewish phenomenon in other circumstances, both in the United States and elsewhere. So.
Do we have an order?
I guess, why don't you go first?
Okay.
Just since you're right next to me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Steve and to Lisa and for Hasia to making this possible. So my topic was Jews in the American music business, the roots of Jewish concentration in the American popular music business, 1890 to 1945. And Hasia mentioned that when one of the concerns that the reluctance of historians to deal with Jews and business is because there are so many anti-Semitic stereotypes that are connected to it. Right now there is an exhibition in London called Jews, Money, and Myth, something along those lines. It has those three words in it. And I haven't seen the exhibition, but my impression is that it seeks to expose how anti-Semitism has played into the image of Jews and money through the ages. There is a new major historical scholarly work with the title The Myth of the Medieval Jewish Moneylender, and it purports to show that the medieval Jewry was not entirely made up of moneylenders, and that's a stereotype, and it's a dangerous and negative stereotype. So clearly this is an explosive kind of topic, Jews and business. And even with regard to the music business, although this may seem mild or even perhaps amusing in comparison, I just happened to discover that a few years ago, Miley Cyrus got in trouble for making a statement in which she said something along the lines of, I don't need some 70-year-old Jewish record executive telling me what's fashionable. I know myself, and I'll decide my own career, and that was controversial. And that also reminded me of the controversies that arose. Maybe you saw the movie by Spike Lee many years ago now. I think it was in the late 90s, called Mo Better Blues. And it was about jazz music, and it featured a couple of obviously Jewish nightclub owners who were exploitative and who were racist, and Lee was called out for buying into the stereotype and for anti-Semitism, and he shot back in a letter to the New York Times by saying, saying that there weren't Jews heavily overrepresented in the music business would be like saying blacks aren't heavily overrepresented in the NBA. It's just a fact, which I have to say, there's some truth to at least. It's what you make of that fact that matters and how you understand it. So that's what I want to do. I want to understand Jewish overrepresentation in the music business in particular, and I think it's in some ways representative of Jewish involvement in other niche areas of the economy and businesses. So I'm not going to go into all of the historical factors that created this Jewish orientation to business. Ones that are often cited are its anti-Semitism itself, the idea that Jews couldn't pursue other supposedly more wholesome or normal or typical occupations like agriculture, or they couldn't be part of guilds, and so through this history of exclusion, because of the need to survive, they gravitated towards positions that were regarded as unsavory by the traditional societies. And also there are more positive explanations that Jews possessed credit networks that facilitated the acquisition of capital that made business possible. And I think there's truth to all of these and many other explanations, but when I'm focusing in on the music business itself in America, I would cite one in particular that isn't as often referred to, and that is the connection between the hub and the hinterland. We have this notion of Jews being city people, being typical urbanites, and there's some truth to it, and obviously New York City enjoys a kind of pride of place in American Jewish history as a cultural and demographic center. But I think, and of course New York City was aside from LA, was the center of the popular entertainment industry. But I think what's really crucial is the role of Jews in small town America, in rural America. And this is something that Hasia has brought out beautifully in her book, Roads Taken, on the history of Jewish peddlers. Especially in the 19th century, the tendency of Jews not just to settle in big population centers, but to cover the broad landscape of the American hinterlands. And what is the importance of this? Well, let me come back to that in a minute. So in my contribution, I wanted to understand something that I hadn't really grappled with before, because I've written a lot about Jews in rock and roll. I've written about Jews in the music publishing industry, phenomena which are essentially later, which are for the most part post-World War II period. But I never really came to terms with how it all got started. Excuse me. And that's what I tried to do in this essay. And I think the thing that I discovered, and it may not be much of a discovery for anybody else, but it was for me, that it wasn't sheet music publishing, it was theater. It was the involvement of Jews in small town theaters across America that was, in a sense, the genesis of so many things. Jews, by the 1870s, 1880s, certainly the 1890s, were increasingly prominent as lessors of theaters, managers of theaters in medium-sized towns and cities in all states in the country, particularly in the Northeast and in the Midwest and in the West. They were involved, this involvement in acquiring or managing theaters led to Jewish involvement in booking, in the booking process, controlling the product that was shown in the theaters through centralized arrangement of what acts would perform where, when, and attempting to establish monopoly control over that process. Now, Jews didn't do it themselves. There were non-Jews who were partners in these enterprises. There were non-Jews who were rivals. Jews were rivals of one another. So it isn't a conspiracy, as the anti-Semites would have it. It is a pattern, which I'll talk about in a moment. And when you see the concentration of Jews in theater management, theater ownership, the control of chains of theaters, and the booking process, that, to me, is the entree into sheet music publishing, also Hollywood, because so many of these theaters would then become available as venues for the presentation of film shorts as they began to move out of the Nickelodeons and into the silent film era, where audiences would come to a theater, be entertained by a band, and then have a band or a musician at least playing the background, the soundtrack, as it were, to the movie that was being shown. And eventually, this also led to Jewish ownership of jazz venues, of rock venues, impresarios, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if I had time, and I don't, I could construct the chains that would, and the links that would show how from this anchor in theater management, everything else eventually flowed, to the point where a Miley Cyrus could hold a widespread perception that even Jews in the corporate music business of the early 21st century, even that corporate music business was, in some sense, a Jewish business. Okay, so what is the connective tissue? I mentioned this small town, so let me mention a few names. Do I have a couple more minutes, or am I running out? 2 minutes, okay. So here are some names. Abraham Lincoln Erlanger, who founded what became known as the Syndicate of Theater Ownership, that really had a monopoly almost on all legitimate theater as opposed to vaudeville theater, came from Albany. His partner, Al Heyman, came from Wheeling, West Virginia. Another partner, Samuel Needlinger, changed his name to Samuel Nixon, from Fort Wayne, Indiana. The fourth partner, Charles Frohman, and there were two non-Jewish partners, from Sandusky, Ohio. And we look at another group involved in booking and management of legitimate theater, of course, the Schuberts. Where did they come from? Syracuse, New York, along with Sam Katz, who with Balaban and Katz was a big owner of movie theaters in the Chicago and Midwest area. Jules Stein, who started Music Corporation of America, MCA, that was known as the Octopus, that had a massive, notice there was an octopus in your essay as well, that had a massive control over band bookings in mid-20th century America before his disciple, Lou Wasserman, moved to L.A. and established a foothold in the movie industry. He came from South Bend, Indiana. Samuel Roxy Rothhoffel, who was a theater designer and impresario from Stillwater, Minnesota. You get the idea. And the idea is that from roots in peddling, from establishing general stores, to noticing that there were theaters available and that this was a potential niche that one could move into as an entrepreneur is not a giant leap. And so I try in my essay to describe how that phenomenon worked and what the long-term consequences of it were. Thank you.
So it's a great privilege to be here. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Hasia. It's great to be with you, Jonathan. So Hasia said that the volume has essays that are focused on industries, in some cases like the music industry. And then there's some that are biographical. And so mine falls in that latter category. I'm working on a biography of Eli Black. He was the last CEO, and in some ways the first CEO of a company known as United Brands. But he was the last CEO of United Fruit that was inside of United Brands. And United Fruit is a somewhat famous / infamous business that has captured Jewish entrepreneurship quite a bit. So if you were paying attention over the last few years, there was a book by Rich Cohn called The Fish That Ate the Whale that was about Samuel Zemurray. And Samuel Zemurray was Jewish and was one of the probably the most important CEO that elevated United Fruit to its great profits producing bananas. United Fruit is known for Chiquita bananas. But also treachery in Latin America. So under Samuel Zemurray, there was the concept of the banana republic was born, whereby if he didn't like the ways in which the country was allowing him to export bananas or was putting tariffs on them that he didn't like, well, then he could call the CIA, or he could actually use his white fleet. That's what the fleet of ships was called that carried cargo from Latin America, mostly bananas, to the United States. You could fill them with weapons and send them from the harbors in New Orleans to stage coups throughout Latin America. So Samuel Zemurray, also known as the Banana Man, has been really, when we talk about Jews and United Fruit, it's really been focused on Samuel Zemurray. Eli Black had a relatively short tenure. In 1970, he took over United Fruit. It was regarded as an incredible coup in the business world. He came from obscurity. He was someone who was seen as an outsider, for sure. Partly that was because of his Jewish faith, but also because he came from really an immigrant background, rags to riches story. His father immigrated on February 3rd, 1924. That's going to be an important date as I tell this story. And that's an important date just in 1924 because, as some of you will know, one of the strongest immigration restriction acts was taking place in that time. And the Johnson-Reed Act, which was restricting in some ways immigration of people like him who was coming from Poland. And his father, Ben Zion Blackovitz, that was the name. The name was shortened to Black later on, got in just under those restrictions, right? And then later on, Eli Black, as a 2-year-old, came with his mother and his 2 sisters. And they grew up in the East Side, or in the Lower East Side, and he was raised to be like his father and 10 generations before him as a rabbi. And he was destined to be a rabbi, and he went to yeshiva, and then stayed on for seminary, and he became a rabbi in 1941. But through those warriors, he started to doubt whether being a rabbi was going to be the best way to change the world, to bring healing to this world. And he was also reading about a concept known as tikkun olam. And this is the idea of healing the world through your work. And for him, he had a crisis of faith during the World War II where he thought, me preaching to people in Long Island, where that was the place that he practiced, was just not enough. And he started taking business classes at Columbia University and eventually got a business degree and then gravitated into the business world. He took a job with Lehman Brothers and was incredibly successful. So successful that he reformed the Missouri Pacific Railroad as just basically an agent of Lehman Brothers working for Robert Young, who owned the company. And from that point forward, he started to find opportunities to become a chairman. And the first chairmanship that he elevated to was American cap industry. And it was interesting. The company made, if you remember, milk bottles, and I'm from Vermont, so we still have milk bottles, glass milk bottles, but glass milk bottles didn't have plastic tops. They had paper tops. And that's what AMK, which was eventually the Wall Street code for the American cap company, was AMK, and it was for the paper caps. And he was able to take over this company and make millions of dollars, right? He went from a $5 million industry to $30 million. And that allowed him to then buy Morel Meats in the Midwest. And it went from $30 million to an $800 million company. And so right around 1967 to 68, United Fruit had started to not produce as many profits and became vulnerable to takeovers. So there was all these companies that felt, okay, we can take this company, we can take it over. But Eli Black waited out all these big suitors and eventually was able to corner the market and take over United Fruit. So great success story in many ways. And it was through the work as a CEO that he began to act on that concept of healing the world. And in specific, he saw United Fruit as the company that he could make his mark, because Samuel Zemurray, because of the kind of treachery that I've briefly described had happened, he thought, no, what better way to make my mark than turn around the reputation of this company? So what United Fruit had done prior to him had been to import North American labor into Honduras, which was the primary site for producing bananas. Most of the workers there, the managers there, were North Americans, and he turned it all around. He started hiring Hondurans. 99% of the people that he hired by 1971, after 1 year, were now Hondurans. He started creating opportunities for them to own their own homes, and then started to turn over the land, which was extraordinary, because in 1954, United Fruit facilitated the coup of Guatemala because there was an expropriation of land by the Arbenz government in Guatemala. Well, in 1971, he started to turn the land back over to Honduran people and let them grow and be owners of property. So it sounds like a great story, right? Well, Eli Black, when I found him, was mostly maligned, was mostly someone who was seen in the same regard as Zemurray, because in 1975, February 3rd, 1975, in fact, he went to the 44th floor of the Pan American Building in Midtown Manhattan. It's now the MetLife Building. Knocked out a nickel-inch thick plate glass window, and he dove to his death. Right. So for the most part, people have regarded him as a failure, and worse, that he was someone who had perpetuated the negative stereotypes of United Fruit, and Jewish businessmen. Why do I say that? Because soon after his death, it was revealed that he had bribed the president of Honduras to lower tariffs, and had another bribe coming, right? Kind of appropriate on this day when we got the Mueller report, right? But in this case, where there was smoke, there was fire. And in fact, rather than face the music, he knew this was coming, shareholders would be affected, and that the world would see that he was a fraud to some extent. He decided to kill himself. He left no suicide note. Well, actually, he left a brief suicide note. It said early retirement. Yeah. But in the end, what was wiped out was this story that I knew percolating, right? That he was trying to do good, that he had been a rabbi, and that it was important to capture the ways in which his religion motivated his business acumen, right? His purpose in life. Why do I know this? Because in the records that I've researched, his friends said that, right? They talked about him as an important person. He not only did United Brands have United Fruit, but it also had Inner Harvest that grew lettuce in California. And he was agreeing to contracts with the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. The title of the piece in the book is called A Just and Righteous Man, and that's a quote from Cesar Chavez eulogizing Eli Black. Cesar Chavez would frequently go to New York, celebrate the holy celebrations with Eli Black. And so he was regarded as someone who actually had ethics. The other reason why I know that he was thinking about this and wanted to change the world with his business is because he himself talked about socially conscious capitalism. These are concepts that we are now familiar with through Ben and Jerry's or Whole Foods or various other, the owner of Starbucks, right?
Howard Schultz.
Schultz, right? And in fact, Eli Black was already articulating these ideas, right? So in the piece, what I try to do is capture the good of Eli Black, what he was trying to achieve, and the ways in which his religious background motivated him to do some of the good things that were lost in that act of diving from the 44th floor of the Pan American Building. I just want to just close it by saying that the day that his father came to America, February 3rd, 1924, 51 years later, right, February 3rd, 1975, is when he committed suicide. I have no evidence to say that there is actually some kind of correspondence with those dates, but it seems eerily coincidental. And so I'm still in the process of writing the book, and this article was the first foray into telling this very important story. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you both. And in some ways, I'm very proud that what will be two really important books are getting have had their debut in doing business in America, a Jewish history, and that someday when somebody does the kind of historiography, they will cite this as the launch for, again, I think 2 books, which will really have a tremendous impact in American history, American business history, American Jewish history, and beyond. So thank you for having said yes to me. So there's so much that I could ask each one of you individually, but I found a hook in Matt's last, if I saw the text, it would have been his last paragraph or so, and it's a phrase that Jonathan used, which was exploitative or exploitation. And then it was this phrase, socially conscious capitalism. Okay, one might say that business is never exploitative. It's always about making a profit. Okay, I mean, and how much will the market bear? And if one, now this is from somebody who's never had a business, wants to, I mean, you're in a business to make profit, right? What does it take to do that? What are you, as the business person, willing to do in order to maximize your profits?
Right.
On the other hand, can capitalism ever be socially conscious? In the sense that capitalism at its core is about a kind of hierarchical relationship of the seller wanting to, in essence, get the somebody to buy, okay, and at as high a price as possible, with the least amount of effort. So how do the two of you reconcile these words of exploitation and socially conscious capitalism as perhaps a kind of a theme that in your writings you might want to kind of grapple with, and again putting it in the context that Jewish law is very clear about issues involving profit and the obligation of the business person to in terms of dealing with laborers and dealing with competitors and so on. So
I think that the story of Eli Black provides a kind of parable, an example, right? A parable, right? Parable of the question that you're asking, right? It's like, is it possible? And in some ways, his failure is that parable. It's a way in which he had this life vision, right, to make business do the work that he could not do as a rabbi, right? And so what he saw, at least in the times that he was succeeding, was that he was expanding the wealth of, in some cases, a particular country, Honduras, or a company, right, that then could be redistributed to his employers, his employees. And so he felt like he had a responsibility to employees. That went further in the case of Honduras, in which he was thinking about how he could redistribute that wealth to a country that had been wronged by the very company that he actually took over. So for him, it was about creating wealth and then redistributing it, right? So it's not just about what are you doing to produce that wealth, but it's how you distribute it. And for him, creating opportunities to own your own home, creating opportunities for your children to go to schools, ending polio and malaria in Honduras through the hospitals he was investing in, was a way of doing good by creating more wealth.
I mean, in a way, Black is fascinating in that he would have been, in fact, familiar. Like, I think maybe unlike many of the people you were you're studying, Black would have known, sort of Jewish law, the very complex kind of compendium of both. Precept and then the kind of response, the discussions about what did this mean. So as somebody who went through yeshiva at the high school level, but also at yeshiva college, the rabbinical school,
that's right.
This would have been in a way totally part of his kind of bank of knowledge. And so in a way, it's a really fascinating example of somebody who actually knew. Okay. Yes. So what do you think? Is there such a thing as exploitation when you want to make a profit?
The word exploitation has two different meanings. It means taking advantage of somebody, but it also means making use of something. So you exploit natural resources. You exploit the markets that are available. I think what I may have failed to mention that this article is is part of a book which is really about blacks and Jews in the music business. It's about African Americans and Jewish Americans. And to make a long story short, it illustrates both sides of what I think we're talking about right now. Jews were the entrepreneurs and the brokers of African American music, by and large, certainly in the post-World War II period. And it was Jews who founded these, what they called little indie labels, Chess Records. Some of you have heard of them, or you've heard of some of them. Atlantic Records, King Records, again, all over the country, in smaller cities very often. A number of them, not a small city, but a number of them in LA, Modern Records, for instance. And these were record companies that had black musicians and artists and sold the product to black consumers. This was before the period of what they call crossover, when to the surprise and amazement of many of these entrepreneurs, white kids started buying this music eventually. And then you had another revolution in American popular culture and capitalism. But the point is that while there were some black record companies, these Jewish-owned companies were giving opportunities to African American musicians that they might not otherwise have gotten. And they were making available what we now see as very often phenomenal, rich music to African American consumers. And at the same time, they were exploiting, in the sense of taking advantage of these artists by, well, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, cheating them, or at least paying them very little, and sometimes deceiving them. So how do you judge that ethically? Giving opportunities and making black music a commodity that becomes really part and parcel of the fabric of American culture on the one hand, that's a benefactor as far as I'm concerned. And then, of course, we've all heard the stories. And if you see The Sopranos or recall The Sopranos and the character of Hesh, you may remember that Hesh was one of these Jewish music entrepreneurs who was being sued by a black rapper named Massive Genius. And on behalf of all of the black artists that Hesh had ripped off all of those many years ago. And Hesh confers with Tony about how he's going to get out of this lawsuit. And finally, they hit upon a brilliant plan, which is that Massive Genius has sampled so many of these records without paying royalties that he's going to countersue him, and therefore they'll just be even. But I do think that that the two senses of exploitation, the good sense and the bad sense, are both present. And we have to deal with that ambiguity whenever we're dealing with business and capitalism. This is aside from the socially conscious capitalism, because not a lot of these guys thought of themselves as socially conscious people in the sense that Eli Black did. I just mentioned that I come from Binghamton, New York, or at least I live there, and have lived there for a long time. And Binghamton, New York was really founded by the Endicott Johnson Shoe Company, and it was a company town where the founder, George P. Johnson, subsidized the housing of immigrants, subsidized their education, gave them free health care. It's not the same kind of conscientious capitalism, but it was a paternalistic capitalism that is an interesting backdrop to what we're talking about.
Right, and so that when we, again, in both contexts, the word paternalism when it comes to business is also one of those really loaded words. And how, when, again, you know, we could judge however we want, but when you're writing, you're in a different kind of position,
Yeah.
and you want to be able to take a word like paternalism and look, thinking about what Black does in Honduras, he gives them this, he gives them that, which is, on the one hand, that sounds really impressive, which no doubt it was. But what is the problem or the value of using a word like paternalism in terms of understanding how this business person who in this both contexts happen to be Jews, okay, go about this process of giving. And so I think Steve mentioned that I did, it's ironic, I did the biography of Julius Rosenwald for the Jewish Lives series, which is financed by the Black family.
Yes.
So at Rosenwald, it was the same kind of issue of he gave money and to all sorts of people, all sorts of endeavors, particularly African Americans. And, some historians have seen this as incredibly paternalistic. He's not asking, what do you want, but giving. So when we think again about this sort of conundrum of the businessman who ultimately wants to make a profit. I mean, I have to keep coming back to that because nobody's in it for charity. If he would have become a social worker, right? Or he could have remained a rabbi or become a labor organizer. But the business, the profit issue is there in all of these contexts.
Well, first of all, the notion of paternalism was almost 180 degrees from what United Fruit had practiced before, which was just taking as much profit as possible and extracting it and moving it to the north. So paternalism was a vast improvement on what United Fruit had done. And in fact, in the newspapers that wrote quite a bit about blacks' experiments in Latin America, New York Times the most, they did call it paternalism, but they meant it in a positive way, right? Finally, this company is taking responsibility for the people that they've wronged for many, many decades, right? And so that was a mark of pride. What's interesting about doing business, which is we're not talking about, but falls into it as well, is the obligation to shareholders.
Right.
Right. So there's the obligation to your employees, but there was the obligation to the shareholders. And so paternalism is only possible when you're honoring your obligation to the shareholders. Right. And that's really what undid Eli Black. He was challenged by a few things. Natural disaster, Hurricane Fifi hit in 1974. He was challenged by the oil embargo, which oddly, of course, is wrapped up in Israel, and it affected the freight cost, right? And therefore, it forced ethical choices. Was he going to continue to honor his obligation to the shareholders, or was he going to continue to try to do good with his employees? And in the end, the answer was decided in that fateful day, right? He was going to do right by the shareholders. And so that's why I see it as a sort of parable for this notion of socially conscious capitalism. Are they compatible? Can you do good in a business context, especially when you have obligations of accumulating wealth and giving it to the people that have invested in you?
Can I ask you a question?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Wait, in your contribution to the volume, you talk about the Jewish street, the street where there are kosher butchers and other shops that may be Jewish owned, some of which cater to specifically Jewish needs, some of which have a broader market. But you talk about it as the sort of the heart and the heartbeat of a given Jewish community in America. And you also mention or refer to a book about the Jews of Boston. You know, why Jews left Boston and Catholics stayed behind. It's not the exact title, but it's something like that. So I guess my question is, I totally agree with you that the Jewish business district, and we had one in Binghamton, there's even a kind of self-made book called When Court Street Was Jewish. Court Street was the main Jewish thoroughfare, or the main business thoroughfare in Binghamton. But what happens when these Jewish business districts dissolve? Right. You know, what happens to the Jewish communities? Do they reconstitute themselves in other forms?
Okay.
I guess I'm
Yeah,
fascinated by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really rich topic, and it would in some ways be a fantastic essay in a volume on suburbia, the Jews of suburbia, because much of this dissolution of the Jewish street, while it happened over and over and over again, so the Jews of the Lower East Side moved to Brownsville or to Harlem, but in each of the Bronx, and in each place they create a new Jewish street. But at some point they move beyond the boundaries of the walking city,
Right.
And that's where, in essence, the street disappears.
Right.
And so the piece that Jonathan was referring to is a book about Boston, and the historian, sociologist who wrote it said that the death knell for Dorchester and Roxbury was not when the synagogues moved, not when any of the sort of, when the Hebrew College moved, but it was when the G&G Deli moved.
Right.
Okay, the neighborhood absolutely was in despair, and there was no reason to be there. So I think that the study of the next phase, that is the suburban phase, asks how do these kinds of Jewish shopping districts, they disappear, but in what way do new kinds of places start fulfilling those functions, so that, again, that was not my goal, so I'm not going to answer it in any depth, but just to say that in some suburban communities, the Jewish Community Center would sell challah on Fridays, so that people coming to the JCC to go to the gym or to take their kids to nursery school would pick up their challah at the JCC, which is very different
Yes.
than going into the bakery. Right, and all of the kinds of exchanges between people, both between customers among themselves as well as the customer and the merchant, are re-articulated when it's not a store, and then multiply this by all the other kinds of Jewish businesses. So I think it's a fascinating subject and beyond my scope. I know we're going to break and very quickly to have your questions, but I do want to ask one question of the two of you, and maybe we only just take a few seconds. Jonathan, in his talk, made some very important points about Jews essentially playing the middleman role. Those who got the lease on the theater, those who did the booking, those who did the managing, those who controlled the process. So how much can we think of Black as a middleman between, and in a sense, is all of business not about middlemen?
Yes,
And, and there we again get the classic Jewish role of between.
Right.
Okay, they're not in
Nicht to hin and nicht to her.
as they say in Yiddish. It's not exactly. And how much of, in a sense, is that the anomaly of the Jew in the non-Jewish society a reflection of business, or is business a reflection of their anomalous status? So do you see Black as a middleman?
Well, I think he's best described as a middleman in terms of the way I was describing his responsibility to shareholders, right?
Okay.
And so those shareholders trusted him to bring them profits, right? And he had his customers, and it was a great burden in many ways. But it was a burden that he couldn't bear in the end because of the very difficult economy that was happening in the 1970s. This was a period in which the United States started to falter. It was the first time in which we were importing more than we were exporting, right? And so that obligation to do the good that he wanted, right, to support employees both in the United States and in Latin America, but also to honor the shareholders was a kind of vice for him. And I think of him in this context as a middleman between those that wanted to maximize capital accumulation on Wall Street and the people that were working and trying to do right by the companies that he owned.
Okay. So I'm going to throw out the last comment, and then I think will be time for questions. So I can't help it, but I believe in reading through these essays many times, I may have been, in my piece, the only one for whom gender was a category of analysis. And how does one write about the two narratives, the two stories that you've told, and all the others in the book, where men are the actors, but yet try to essentially think about the fact of their manliness as part of this story.
Can I say?
Sure, absolutely.
You know, and I thought a lot about this, or not enough, but I'm starting to think a lot about it. On the one hand, and this doesn't sound very flattering, but I do think that an aspect of Jews' involvement in the music business, Jewish men's involvement in the music business, was coming together with other Jewish men, mostly Jewish men, and black men and women, and having a kind of group experience, creating a subculture of hipness in that environment, which in a sense excluded their wives, excluded their daughters. So that's on the one hand. But it didn't involve any religious aspects. Right. It was a secular Jewish subculture of hipness. On the other hand, we see so many examples, as you refer to in your article, of wives who are involved in the backdoor side of the business, who are, in a sense, the secret hidden partners, who are helping their husbands to think about strategizing about the business, and sometimes who step forward, especially in the 50s and 60s, begin to step forward and sometimes take control of companies of their own. So I do think that I haven't done enough to bring their contribution out, but I think it's there.
Okay, great. And since the book is in process,
that's right. There's still time.
There's still time. Okay.
I'm struggling with the fact that Eli Black had the access to education and the ability to do the work that he did because of the sacrifices of his sisters in particular. Goldie and Sarah were people that worked so that he could study. And in fact, all the women in his family worked so that his father could be a rabbi and he could go into the rabbinate. And that incredible starting point in his life was created by the sacrifices of women in his family. So I'm reminded of I Teach Bread Givers by Anzia Yezierska, and I see this his younger sister Goldie, who's a bookbinder, right? That's just a perfect example of what Yezierska is capturing in Bread Givers. And so as I write the larger biography, I am trying to get those stories, but I often have to do it without their voices and without their experiences being fully realized and represented in the archive. And that's one of the challenges of being a historian, is to capture those people that you know are important to the subject that you're covering, but yet have not been fully represented in the sources that we draw to tell the stories we tell.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think we're going to now have time for questions. And okay, Steve, do you want me to be the? Yeah, okay, great. So please.
What happened to the Black family after he committed suicide?
So you would think that was just a fateful thing for the family, and in fact, Leon Black, who is someone that supports a book series at Yale and supported Hasieh's book, in fact, is one of the richest men in the world today, for Fortune 500. His son, Leon, was finishing business school, his MBA at Harvard, the very spring that Eli committed suicide, and was able to go on and realize this wonderful career. United Fruit and United Brands was broken up, but the family continued. And I think in some ways, I'm still in the process of writing the book, and that part in particular, but I've flirted with the idea of going well beyond Eli to talk about how wealth is passed down through generations, even and in spite of, or maybe in spite of and even though there was these incidents that were infamous, like paying a bribe to a president of a third world country, and yet still recovering to be a very successful family in the present.
I might tell a quick anecdote, personal anecdote. My older sister dated Leon Black as a teenager, and a very wealthy family, obviously. And at one point, when I mentioned that I was coming here and I was going to meet you and be on a panel with you, my sister told me, you know, one time Mom, our mother, asked me, how's it going with Leon? And I said to him, you know, I don't really like him that much. And my mother said, but couldn't you try to like him?
Very nice. Yes, sir, you had your hand up.
Well, do you analyze at all the Jewish entrepreneurial spirit, or the extent that, you know, the proportionality of Jews being entrepreneurial risk takers? How much of that is in the Jewish religion, the culture, and how much of that is resulting that they were excluded from, you know, certain professions, certain companies that wouldn't hire Jews, Ford Motors, let's say, I don't pick on them, but
right.
Anyway, so yeah. Is it, you know, is it both factors, or is one more dominant than the other?
It's a great question, and a question that historians still haven't come up with a satisfactory answer to. But and Hassia has written about this too. But the notion that it was simply exclusion, I think, is not tenable. When Jews came into Northern Europe, they were already merchants. They didn't have to be excluded from agriculture. They didn't have to be excluded from guilds. They were invited in by nobles, by aristocrats, by landowners to develop the commercial potential of their properties. And we see this pattern repeating itself over and over again. So how did it all start? That is a really difficult question. I think one theory which has been criticized, but I do think has value, is the Jewish, because of course Jews in antiquity were overwhelmingly agrarian, and there was no stereotype about Jews as businessmen. That really didn't emerge until the Middle Ages. But if we're trying to figure out the roots of it, the religious emphasis on literacy, in fact, the requirement, even though it wasn't always met, that a father teach his son to read the Torah, to read some Hebrew, and the numeracy that goes along with the literacy, which is very much a necessity for studying Talmud. Not that all Jews studied or were expert at Talmud. I do think that created a potential for this concentration in business. And the other part of it is that it was only under Islamic rule that Jews became urbanized. I mentioned urbanization. So it was under Islamic rule that this combination of relatively greater literacy and urbanization made it economically valuable for Jews to be involved in business. And that spread into the Ashkenazic world, eventually into the world of Northern Europe. That's the best brief explanation that I can come up with.
Let me just throw in one more element, which is business, unlike agriculture, is portable.
Right.
And that is, if you have a business of one kind, doesn't matter what it is, in one place, you can pick up that same business someplace else. And given, again, their anomalous status, I mean, they were not natural to any to any place. They were always living, particularly in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, at the pleasure of this ruler or that ruler, and if they were living at the pleasure of this ruler and that ruler, they could also be thrown out. And so that the pattern of seeking out places to do business, to carry their business with them on their back, as it were, was a kind of global phenomenon. And they always went from places of essentially more limited and often declining economic prospects to places where new opportunities to do business were beckoning. And so, again, it was partly a kind of lack of rootedness in the place they were because it wasn't theirs. Okay, but it's a question that will never be answered. Okay, and that, it'll never have a real answer.
Okay, I have a two-part question. The first question is for Jonathan. Did you study blacks in other industries other than music? In other words, blacks and Jews, blacks coming from other types of industries besides music, or was it just music?
I focused on music, but I have a chapter on Jews as historians of the black experience.
For example, Jews coming from the Deep South to, let's say, California and working with Jewish families and,
Blacks coming from the South and working with
Jews
Jews
coming
in
west
LA.
and working with,
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely focused on the music business. I looked at the liquor business, the cigarette business. These were all bridges to the music business. Mm-hmm. These are cigarettes and liquor are sold in and used in nightclubs. So there's a natural link there. And in fact, Leonard Chess, the co-founder with his brother of Chess Records, had a bar in the south side of Chicago, and he noticed, the customers, the black customers coming in and what they were listening to. And his father was a junk dealer, which is another bridge industry, salvage. That's a typical Jewish industry. But one that surprised me a little bit was used furniture, because apparently people would bring in their used furniture, and Jews were refurbishers or resellers of used furniture, but some noticed that customers would come in and look in the cabinets to see if they could find 78 records there that had been left over. And that, it's a light going off in the head. Oh, people want this. People like this. People are willing to buy this. They're actually making great efforts to pursue it. So I don't know if that
my other
answers-
question is a broader question. There's a lot of anti-everything in today's society, not just anti-Semitism, but anti-this and that and the other thing. The three of you, can you come up with ideas on how we can foster a gentler, kinder,
Well, I mean, Eli Black, I got to this subject because of the book that I wrote about Cesar Chavez. And what was extraordinary is that because he owned Inner Harvest, and Inner Harvest actually grew more lettuce than any company in California. And after they won the grape contracts, the UFW, they were going to turn to lettuce and boycott them, right? And Eli Black helped nip that in the bud to some extent because he agreed to contracts for his workers at Inner Harvest, and he got incredible anti-Semitic responses from his fellow growers, right? But it was actually that relationship that really blunted the effects of the anti-union movement and the responses to Cesar Chavez, and ultimately Eli Black was on the right side of history in that case. So he was recognizing something with regards to the affinities with the UFW and with Mexican Americans and Filipinos that his grower companions or fellow growers did not see. So in this regard, I would say he was using business in a positive way to, and absorbing that anti-Semitism, but at the same time turning it to do good.
Well, I mean, the only answer I could give you would be political, and I don't think I should do that out there. But I think that certainly it has really nothing to do with my sort of expertise as a historian or my experience as a historian. But certainly the kind of hatreds and kind of overt, hideous attacks on people within American society, requires us to start thinking about all of our neighbors as our fellow human beings, and however different they may be, we should celebrate. I mean, it's a very trite answer.
Try to understand each other.
Yeah, and but again, it's a very trite answer. But the only other solutions I could give you were political, and I wasn't asked to do that. So
I just add that two things. First, I think it's essential to understanding Jewish liberalism, Jewish idealism, to recognize that it is in part, I'm not saying this is the only motive for it, but it is in part motivated by an effort to dispel the kind of anti-Semitism that sees Jewish capitalism and Jewish business and Jewish money as exploitative. We're not exploitative because we're philanthropists or we're activists for the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. And that could be a subconscious process, not necessarily a conscious process. And the other thing I would say is, it probably won't do any good, but I just don't like ceding the topic to the anti-Semites. I really think that we Jewish historians should seize the topic of Jews in business and try to understand it accurately, responsibly, and not say we're going to push it under the rug, because that just gives ammunition for those with hostile motives to misuse it.
I think which gets us back to Derek Penslar's contention in Shylock's Children, which is this silence among Jewish historians about Jews in business is just no longer appropriate. And this is an enormous, it's as much a part of the long history of the Jews as, learning, or as all sorts of other aspects which we have been comfortable talking about. It's now time to take this profound part of Jewish history and to subject it to the same kind of analysis that the rest of Jewish history, the other parts of Jewish cultural and social traditions has been studied.
I wanted to add one more thing, just inspired by George Lipsitz, who's a fantastic historian and studies music as well. But he had this idea that really influenced me as a young scholar, and it sticks with me here, in that he talked about families of resemblance in immigrant communities and communities that suffer from discrimination. So when I saw Black agreeing to contracts with Cesar Chavez, and seeing in the immigrant experience of the Filipino and the Mexican his own immigrant experience, I saw there what George is talking about, this notion of a family of resemblance. And what that means is that you can recognize, if not the exact same experience, at least something that resonates across groups and across time. And so I think that was a powerful part of what Black was doing. It wasn't just his religion, but it was also that he was an immigrant as well. Yeah. And so when you have the potential in your religious beliefs, something like Tikkun Olam, merging with this experience of being an immigrant, and the world that you occupy is made up of immigrants and employing immigrants, there is the potential for doing good in that way.
Yeah, but if you come from a lower class family, you may not have the same opportunities for education and careers that a more well-off family might have, regardless of your religion or your race.
Certainly, and that's why he was investing in schools in Honduras. That's why he was setting up scholarships for his employees. He was trying to, that's why he didn't, one of the things that also he didn't do is take a huge salary. He was one of the lowest paid, he was the lowest paid CEO in New York on Wall Street through the late 60s and early 70s, and he was noted for that. So this idea of redistributing your wealth was also something that he practiced. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
I had a question. How would you put in perspective the anti-Semitism against George Soros right now?
Well, it fits the whole motif of somebody who stands behind the scenes, although he's kind of obtruding into the scene, but who pulls the strings. This idea of a global conspiracy of powerful Jews who are engineering history and political change is very old. We have traces of it in the Middle Ages, but it really comes out in the early modern period, and it reaches its apogee in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I think that this it shouldn't be shocking, or it is shocking that it's still with us. It can never really be destroyed. It is a motif that obviously has an explanatory power for people that keeps returning, unfortunately.
I mean, I think the attack on Soros is a good deal of this is this kind of hatred of cosmopolitanism,
Yeah.
the idea of somebody who is a global person, somebody who's not of this place, which again takes us back to this kind of imagery of Jews as the sort of wandering people, as never exactly here, but always scouting out someplace else. And so the attack on Jewish cosmopolitanism, again, it has its high point in the anti-Semitic imagery of the late 19th, early 20th century, and culminates in Nazism. Right. And this person with, who's not one of us, and who's kind of global. And obviously this is one of the themes of the contemporary world, right, is the fear of outsiders. I mean, think of Brexit. Right. Okay, we don't want all those Europeans here. The anti-immigrant sentiment that is just rocking not just Europe. So he's just, so yes, it is amazing that it's still sort of targeting a Jew, but it's so consistent with the contemporary rhetoric.
Just quickly add that I agree with you, but it's not just xenophobia. It is also, it goes back to your first question about the nature of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Capitalism is constructive, but it also is corrosive. And free markets are productive, but they are also damaging. When you see what potentially Amazon is doing even to Walmart and Target, we used to think that Walmart was the enemy. Now we're like, please don't close down the Walmart, right. Keep it open, because at least it's local. At least it employs people locally. So there is a threatening, corrosive, very real threat that unrestricted capitalism has, and then you look for a scapegoat. You don't look at it analytically, but you treat the Jew, because the Jew is not rooted, you treat the Jew as the analog or the parable for that unrestricted capitalism, and that's part of the story, I think.
Last question.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your presentations. This is a question request for Professor Garcia. You mentioned Zemurray. who was with Chiquita Banana, and so that he doesn't leave with a complete black eye, maybe you could tell us a little bit about his involvement with the founding of the State of Israel.
Oh, well, I don't write about Samuel Zemurray, so that's not my thing to tell. That's Rich Cohen who tells that story in the book that he wrote. So yeah, I'm not covering him. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. This one. I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to say, just to alert you, our next event is going to be something we're co-sponsoring with Wilshire Boulevard Temple. The Pulitzer Prize finalist Nathan Englander is going to be speaking on April the 3rd, 7:30 at the East Side campus of Wilshire Boulevard. In the meantime, we welcome you all to a reception we have if you go out the door and turn left. And I want to thank our panelists for a very interesting afternoon. Thank you all for coming.